Little Marvin, the creator and writer of Them, a WGA Award nominee in the original long form category. Little, I know you've talked in other interviews about you were inspired by for this show, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago at this point, opening social media and seeing, Black people being terrorized by law enforcement, by white people in general. When you're writing the show, I guess, how did you balance, or how did you think about balancing the gaze of that violence against Black people with how you would depict the violence on the show? And I guess, like, can you talk about like how that was challenging for you, or what you kind of were, what your approach was?
Yeah, it was a balancing act, you know. I mean, it was we wanted to, we set out from the beginning to just sort of be honest and to honestly sort of document and also pay our respects to so many experiences. I mean, when I sat, aside from seeing all the videos of Black folks being terrorized, I also was just reading a lot of books and researching heavily, particularly this time period, and being sort of shocked, maybe naively, by the sort of terror inflicted on families, particularly families who had gone west in search of opportunity. And so there was a violence to that was not only physical, there was a psychic violence, there was an emotional violence, there was like, and that's really what I was most interested in, more than even the physical violence, was the emotional fallout. You know, I had never really seen a story told in that particular time that dealt with the sort of psychological fallout of that kind of stare and that kind of gaze always in your life. And so we led with that. And of course, there's a level of physical violence that goes along with it. But we really sort of tasked ourselves to be as open and as honest as we could with that experience, and to put you in the sort of hot seat, as it were.
Yeah, for sure. Can you talk a little about like what was some of the stuff you were reading? Like, you're right. Like, I've not thought of, maybe naively, I just never thought of like, never like like heading west, and like, obviously, like, that kind of, the house, like home ownership as that kind of like poison pill, maybe, or like an American dream for maybe a white family in the 1950s, and not like that, obviously, for the Emmys in your series, and just Black people in reality. I guess, can you talk a little about like, yeah, like what you found, like what you were reading, to like when that like maybe surprised you, or for was an inspiration?
Sure. I mean, I really wish there had only been one family, frankly, that this was inspired by. But sadly, it was inspired by so many experiences. I mean, in the year that that our show takes place, just to give a family that people know, perhaps, Nat King Cole's family who moved into Hancock Park in just around the same time as our show, and he was a star at the time, a radio star at the time, and I was shocked to see the sort of, not only the vitriol, but the really ugly tactics that the Hancock Park homeowners Association, which I'm sure is very lovely now, but like, back then, not so much. And the extent to which they worked to actively move this family out. I mean, it was every form of threat under the sun. And then as I started peeling back layers upon layers, I think there's this really kind of this sunny ideal of what California is, and that's been really anything but, for so many families, not just Black, but so many families, attempting to integrate what had formerly been exclusively white neighborhoods. So there was a lot of research.
Yeah, obviously the show is a horror series, and horror films, I think, obviously are great vectors for social commentary. I'm not the first person to suggest that, and I think, like, you think of like George Romero or John Carpenter, all these great horror filmmakers have done so much like doing that. I guess when you went into it and came at it from a horror perspective, not obviously you knew that's what you wanted to do, but what maybe surprised you about how elastic the genre was for what you wanted to accomplish, and like kind of like how you wanted to like discuss the social commentary of it within the genre that maybe you didn't even expect heading in?
Certainly. I mean, that's a fantastic question. You've actually named two horror creators that I just admire and who were huge inspirations when I thought about this. I mean, we were referencing a lot of movies from the 60s and 70s in particular because there was sort of an explosive way at which they dealt with the really thorny issues through the lens of horror. When I think about Rosemary's Baby, or when I think about The Exorcist, so many of my favorite films, there's this really gorgeous balance of both the supernatural horror, but also even much more so the psychological again and the emotional fallout. So horror was always the thing. I always think of sort of history as a house, and really what I wanted to do was not come through the front door of history. There was a version of the story I flirted with at the beginning that was much more like a drama, and I consider that kind of going through the front door of the house. Like I could have told this in very much a documentary kind of way, but I was more interested in kind of sneaking around to the back of the house and like breaking open a basement window and letting myself down into like the basement floor of history, like the subterranean place, the subtextual place, like the things that kind of really frightened me personally to grapple with. And so there was never any mistaking that horror was going to be, I'm also a horror nut. So there was no mistaking that that's how it was going to go down. But yeah.
Did you notice that, like, I guess, is it easier to, you mentioned like you could have done it as conventional drama or a straightforward drama when you do a horror show? I mean, like, and based on the response, I think this probably answer is yes. I mean, do you feel like it definitely gets more, it's a louder and more attention getting kind of thing when you do a horror show? And I guess, did that, if not surprised you, were you like, I made the right call on this or whatever? Like, how did you do, like, like what was like?
Sadly, I've never experienced the feeling of feeling like I made the right call. So that's not really something I ever feel. However, I will say that, like, yes, I think that there's a level of accessibility to horror. I think that, like, I consider it almost like sticking the medicine inside like something super yummy, and like the medicine gets in there, but like it goes through this super yummy exterior, which, like, it feels like a roller coaster. I think people love the experience of being scared. I certainly do. And so I think that allows you a greater entry point into some of the deeper, darker things that if I had just played it for sort of domestic drama and only played it without that horror lens, it might have been less palatable in that way. There's still folks who had a hard time with it, even though there's a horror element. But I think there's a certain level of accessibility that it affords you.
Sure. I wanted to talk, you mentioned before, like the supernatural elements. When you guys were in the writer's room and stuff, how did you guys talk about, when you wanted to pull lever on a supernatural element versus like just the pervasive racism and reality of like, what's happening in the world, I guess? And can you talk about like, where you're like, oh, we should, tilt it more this way? How did that like kind of work in the room?
It was a constant like balancing act, and we would toggle back and forth between the two. I mean, we made a very clear point to keep certain storylines very much focused in like the human foibles and the human everyday horror. That was a big conversation at the very beginning, because particularly with Betty, with Alison Pill's character, there had been a time where we flirted with like a little bit of a supernatural component to her story, and it suddenly tipped the scales. It wasn't saying the right thing. Like, we wanted to keep a very clear line and a clear delineation between the horrors that we do to each other, that we inflict to each other as fellow humans, and then the horrors coming from this other realm. So I would say it was a constant sort of dance throughout the whole thing. But there's also a place in our show, I think, the ambition anyway, where the supernatural and the sort of emotional and psychological are all very much tied up. So it gets a little messy for sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've read other interviews. I know you want like I go make the audience uncomfortable. Let's say, like we were saying, like using this, and like I guess like for you, like what was that response? You're like, yes, I'm very happy that this generated this kind of response. I guess like.
Nothing can prepare you for any of it. I mean, like, this is the first time I've ever made a show, so like nothing can prepare you for it. But I have to say too, like, amazing. I think the only thing I would have felt maybe that would have been hard is if it was just crickets and like, radio silence the minute the show came out. That would have hurt me immensely. The fact that there was like so much emotion and people were so passionate on either side, to me, it ended up being an experience that I honestly, I'm so thankful for, because it did what I think I didn't even know, I couldn't articulate I wanted to do. I never set out to make something people talked about. We only set out to make something truthful and hopefully honest, and and it was about the characters. But on the flip side, the fact that like it did engender all of this conversation, to me, it's only positive. I mean, still, like it's crazy. It's certainly crazy, but it's fun too. I mean, it's fun.
I mean, I think the honesty is why people, you know what I mean? Like, I think that actually did, people, that I think helps the conversation, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, if it was, like you said, like radio silence, obviously, I think maybe like, I think people, when they get mad about it or love it, like, I think that is because you're reflecting something that I think they didn't know they wanted to see, or were upset they were afraid to see, that kind of thing. So I do think that ends up paying off. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you have to own those choices, honestly, because I mean, we went into it knowing. I mean, there were certain episodes where I'm like, here we go, but like you have to kind of own it. I mean, that's really what we set out to do, and then when you get that response, you just have to be prepared.
We have to wrap up, but obviously it's an anthology show. Have you thought like when you the second season, or like have you thought about like where you want to go next, and like kind of like have you been tossing around ideas already, and like what do you got? Yeah.
Yeah, currently, I don't know what I'm even allowed to say.
If you can't say much, that's okay. But
The answer is yes, and I love your wallpaper. That's the answer for now.
That's great. That's a good place to stop, I guess. Little Marvin, Writers Guild Award nominee for them. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.